This is Right On Radio, the voice of restoration in fallen Europe.
Welcome to Right On Radio. My name is Daniel Friberg.
And I'm John Morgan.
And the topic of today's program is the European New Right. And joining us to discuss this topic, we have Dr. Tomislav Sunic. Dr. Tomislav Sunic was born in Zagreb, Croatia in 1953. He holds a doctorate in political science from the University of California at Santa Barbara. Dr. Sunic frequently gives lectures on right-wing topics around the world and contributes to the Occidental Observer website and the Occidental Quarterly. He also authored several other books, including Against Democracy and Equality, which was originally published in 1990 and which has subsequently been reissued by Arctos. Homo Americanus, Child of the Postmodern Age in 2007, and Postmortem Report, Cultural Examinations of Postmodernity in 2010. Today, he is one of the directors of the American Freedom Party in the US. He lives in Zagreb. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
Tom, I just wanted to say I'm really glad to have you on the show, because I know we've met several times at conferences in the past in the U.S. And I've told you this before, but I'd also like to say on this program that it was really reading your first book, Against Democracy and Equality. It's one of the reasons that I'm doing Arctos today. You know, I think I first read it around 2001 or 2002, and it was really like an intellectual earthquake for me. You know, I'd heard the names of some of the new right figures before that, but I didn't know so much about them. And you know, for a long time, your book was just about the only thing in English about the European New Right. So I read it, and I really, you know, as I was turning the pages, I just thought, yes, you know, this is my own view on things. So I can really relate to this. So I just wanted to thank you for providing that book, and you know, it indirectly led to my decision to contribute to Arctos ultimately. So thanks a lot for doing that.
Well, thanks also for reprinting the book. And I think Arctos did a good job, and is still doing a good job with other authors. And I must extend my greetings to all Arctos staff. I think you guys are also doing a very good job in terms of enlightening a little bit the wider public about the intellectual background and intellectual heritage, rather, of what we now call right-wingers. I'm not quite happy with the term. Right wing, and I guess this was what the book was all about, the new right. I guess we could discuss about this, about the etymology of the word and the semantic distortions of that expression, but by and large, I'm happy that the book came out.
Well, it was originally your doctoral dissertation, right?
Right. This was my doctoral dissertation, so of course it was written in a very PC lingo back in 87, 88. Yes, I submitted it in 87 at the University of California for publication. And of course, later on when the book came out, I added a preface, and then I also had Kevin MacDonald wrote a portion to it, and also Alain de Benoit, of course, he added something to it. So this now, the current version, the Arctos version, is a much larger version, but as far as the content itself is concerned, there hasn't been much of changes.
Okay, but well, maybe you could just tell us. You know, you were at an American university, and you know, as I'm sure you're aware, the European New Right was almost completely unknown at the time that you would have written the book and your dissertation back in the 80s. You know, I'm sure outside of academics who were specializing in French political thoughts, you know, probably nobody had heard of it. So what led you personally to start engaging with this topic?
Well, I think I have to be quite frank for your listeners and for your audience. Any author, not just me, but literally any author in the world dealing with a specific topic, be it whatever, Cinderella, or be it some political stuff, a sociological theme, or anything, either consciously or subconsciously must be related in some way to the topic under discussion, under his discussion. And I don't want to lie to you. I certainly felt a certain empathy for the authors that I subsequently discussed in my doctoral dissertation and then later on in my book. I guess it's just a matter of temperament, and I could spend now hours and hours talking about my own temperament and my own intellectual background. And even as a boy, I asked myself questions. From what I heard from in the school, back when I was in high school here in communist Yugoslavia, and then later on when I was in the United States, I always wanted to know, is there something else beyond this standard curriculum in academia? Why do we study, for instance, I'll give you a good example. When I was a boy here in communist Yugoslavia, we were bombarded by vulgarized Marx, if I can put it that way. So we had to listen and we had to study some mishmash of pseudo-Marxist literature, and also the literature that was dished out and offered to us by the local commissars. And of course, the first thing that crossed my mind when I was a boy, I wasn't, but when I was 12 or 13, of course, I wasn't much aware of who was Carl Schmitt or Wilfredo Pareto or Robert Michels or little known Alain de Benoit. Back then, I was just brainwashed in a way, certainly much more than you folks back in Sweden or for that matter in the United States of America. It was pretty harsh, so I just had to listen to one specific truth. And as a boy, I just asked myself a question: is there something else in this universe? Is there some other interpretation of events, be they political or historical events, or sociological, of workers' events, you name it? And this is how I, even as a boy, thanks to my old man, thanks to my dad and my mom, to some, also thanks to, you wouldn't believe it, also to Catholic clergy here back in communist Yugoslavia, I just asked myself questions. I wanted to know, is there something else? Is there something beyond this official version of this, of the communist Yugoslav truth? So little by little, I came to, by my own temperament, I came to some authors, like even when I was a boy, I discovered Céline, Louis Ferdinand Céline, the French author.
Oh, yes.
And then, I just sort of started, and then I discovered, thanks to my dad, I discovered he was a very educated man. He was a lawyer, Catholic lawyer. I was literally forced to read Chesterton, which I wasn't, terribly fond of, back in, when I started growing up I was 14, 15, I was very much hooked on the Kinks and the Black Sabbath, that type of rock music. So those things were crossing my mind. But I must admit, I had some of those inner feelings. I just wanted to know, is there something beyond this official truth? And this is how I gradually came to those authors. And back then, I certainly didn't know all those nooks and crannies of theirs, of their political and meta-political messages. But this is how I started sort of building myself up. And then gradually, this avalanche, if I guess I'll put it metaphorically, started rolling down the hill. And, as years went by, I piled up more and more authors. I spent over the last 30, 40 years, I've been most of the time, well, not most of the time, but quite a large chunk of my time I've spent with books and authors who we just call nonconformist. Well, it happened back then, 30 years ago, when I started discovering myself. It happened that those authors were what we now call right-wingers. So this is how I became myself on the quotation marker right-winger, although I must tell you, folks, I don't like this term, and I certainly don't want to portray myself as a right-winger. Well, my enemies, they call me different names, but it's a different story.
Well, I think that kind of gets to the essence of one of the things that you discuss in Against Democracy and Equality, is the fact of how this term "new right" was never actually it wasn't invented by Benoit or his colleagues. It was actually given to them by the French media, which I think is confusion that's persisted up to the present day.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because even nowadays, and Alain de Benoit frequently complains to me, even nowadays, folks, particularly in the United States of America and then, let's say, in the UK to some extent also, confuse this expression, the new right, with American neoconservatives.
Yes.
These are two opposite planets altogether, because precisely the so-called, I repeat, the so-called European New Right or the French New Right is the very opposite of neoconservatives in the United States of America. Hence the reason I'm keen. This is also part of my trade, the comparative linguistics. I always like to clarify the concepts we're dealing with.
Although I would say that my experience is that I mean, neoconservatism is a very common concept in the U.S., but not so much in Europe. So
absolutely, you're quite right, because neoconservatism, neukonservativ, and I think that this is a German word. I presume it's similar to the Swedish. I'm saying this because I'm not unfortunately fluent in Swedish, but I'm quite fluent in the German language. So the Germans, even back, in the Weimar Republic, they used the term Neukonservativen, which literally meant, or still means, new conservatives. Even folks, let's say, from the Junge Freiheit, which is a very prestigious weekly, let's call it German Neoconservative New Right Journal, which has absolutely nothing to do with the Weekly Standard or commentary in the United States of America. Unless, as I say, unless we clear those first concepts, unless we clear those semantic distortions, literally, we end up in misunderstandings and false conclusions.
And the main problem here is basically that the American neoconservatism is not really conservatism at all. It's like it's a leftist ideology, basically, it created by old Trotskyists, and kind of just dressed up as some sort of right-wing ideology to appeal to right-wing voters. But it's not right-wing and it's not conservative at all in reality.
I'm so glad that you're really pointing this out. Now, those expressions, or rather those denominators, that's the better expression. In Germany, even folks who are not necessarily on the same page, in Germany they make sense. But when I talk to people, even here in the media in Croatia, when I say the word the new right or even neoconservatives, they don't quite understand. They just can't single out those nuances very well. They just, they accept this word in a rather derogatory fashion. So I guess we are the ones, and including, I presume, also the Arctus editors, they're the ones who really need to clarify those concepts. And of course, always in the right specific time. As Alain de Benoit has told me many, many times, and I'm now basically recapping what he has told me so many times, we have accepted this denomination, the new right, short of something better, meaning because there is no way of always explaining to our detractors, or let alone our enemies or opponents, that what the new right is all about. That this has actually nothing to do with what is now nowadays known as conservatism. So we really have to be very, very careful about the usage and use and misuse of this expression.
Daniel and I are fond of using a term that I originally borrowed from Evola, which is the true right, or sometimes we say the real right, to refer to this older type of right-wing thought that goes back to opposition to the French Revolution, and also of course even earlier ideologies that weren't even called right-wing as such, because they just seemed completely normal to people.
Absolutely. No, again, sir, we're dealing here with those semantic distortions, and I've been thinking about this. What might be the better substitute for the word new right? Probably the word traditionalist might be better. But then again, this is also a trap. Even I use quite often the word traditionalism, and of course we refer to Guénon, we refer to Julius Evola. But hold it, we also got to be careful what type of a tradition we are trying to restore. There is one tradition goes back to Christian tradition, there is one a pagan tradition, and of course Julius Evola, he was the advocate of Hyperborean tradition. And then of course you have a tradition, a pagan tradition. So again, we really always have to know exactly how we define political concepts, and secondly, what were the origin of those words, and what were the possible transformations over the years and centuries. Even I'll take the word, I'm sorry for digression, if you take the word pagan, nowadays even if you say pagan, here in Croatia, pogan, it has a very derogatory meaning. So folks, if I were to use it now, let's say in the church ambiance here in Croatia, in a positive sense, in the neutral sense, the folks would just look at me and they would say, is this guy crazy? What is he advocating? Paganism. And again, we have to be careful. Unfortunately, we live in, especially now, this politically self-censoring environment, we have to be extremely careful how we actually toss around those words. But as I said at the beginning, short of a better substitute, and I'm just using the word new right.
Yeah, and I totally agree that that is probably the best concept available to us right now, because we don't want to choose a term that can be too divisive in these crucial times that we live in. We need to bring people together and fight for the same cause, which means for European civilization. And as you explained very well, traditionalism can be a bit divisive because we have several different traditions, and if and many of the followers of these different traditions hate the followers of the other traditions. So maybe it's better to use the term new right or true right. Or
absolutely, I fully agree with you. We are basically doing some educational and pedagogical work. So as I said, we just have to, at least we ourselves, we have to agree upon a common denominator.
Yes,
absolutely. And and I can also agree with John that your book was actually the first book I read on the New Right. It was a long time ago. I read it right before I got hold of Michael O'Meara's book, which is a bit similar. I mean, your book was first, and it was the first book I read on the New Right in English, and Michael O'Meara's book, New Culture, New Right, came a bit after that, and I read that as well. And those two books had a tremendous impact on my own ideological development. So I can only agree with John that you did many people a huge service by writing this book. It was very influential for both me and John, and I'm sure a lot of other people that have probably been motivated into actually doing something significant after reading it and getting inspired. So thank you for that, Tom. And can I just ask you what prompted you to write this dissertation on this particular subject?
I explained, I guess, a little bit earlier. I was talking about this intellectual curiosity that was always simmering somewhere in my own body system, so to speak, and I always wanted to find out if there is an opposite to Sartre, for instance, if there is an opposite to, let's say, Marx, if there is an opposite to Engels, if there is an opposite to Lukács. And I did find many, many ones. And whether you like it or not, once you start dealing with those opposites, and now in this sense we are talking about the heritage of the New Right, then immediately you have to delve a little bit into modern history, of course, into historiography. Then you start expanding your fields. And of course, you got to be careful how you walk on those fields, because very often you encounter some minefields, especially when you study modern historiography and modern body count, so to speak. So yes, indeed, I've been pretty much, I don't consider myself an expert in one field. I'm happy to tell you, if I may make another digression, and I've been reading now Shakespeare over the last couple of months, and ancient Greek classics. And right now I've just finished and rereading the book by Marcus Aurelius. So basically, if you ask me bluntly, I'm happy to tell you that those guys also, they belong to the New Right under quotation marks, because they are part of our heritage. And we must be proud to and I'm proud to tell you that often I discover when I read, let's say, what was this this little island, this last piece by Shakespeare. It's just on the top of my tongue. Anyway, so very often I can transpose and I can project Shakespeare's verses into our modern political environment. And sometimes I can better understand the political environment of today by reading the classics than by just regurgitating some political stuff. So yes, indeed, those people also belong to our heritage of the so-called New Right, and we got to be proud of that.
I know you've said in a number of places, Tom, that you've always been quite rather partial to literature, I think.
Right.
I always hear you referring to literary figures more than to political things. Well, of course, you sometimes reference political thinkers too, but I've noticed you seem to be partial to more literary authors. Is that true?
Right, absolutely. In fact, as I say, the way I study, of course, I graduated in political science, but I don't like this functional type of approach, or let's say expert type of approach, where you just have to stay all your life focused on one single field. And I guess it's probably one of my advantages, that I think I have a metaphorical mind. So Again, I sometimes learn about the human decision, or rather the case of emergency in political science, or the when let's say, hypothetically speaking, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, whoever might be sitting in the White House, a person has to make a very strong decision in a matter of hours. And then, of course, again, a person who has a metaphorical mind, the person, I presume, who is well read and well educated, can certainly recall some passages from Macbeth and from Shakespeare, and also from Richard III, where this liar, this really an inveterate liar, Richard III, was such a good con man. He could fool everybody. I mean, his relatives, everybody. He was really a nasty leader, whatever. Let's avoid now big epithets. But the fact of the matter, he was an incredibly sharp guy. He actually could switch to a different level of analysis in a matter of minutes. So I guess, again, I wouldn't like to pontificate now about Shakespeare, but a person. Well, take Carl Schmitt, take some great political science scholars like Carl Schmitt, even Wilfredo Pareto, and of course there are many, many others. All those people, if you read in their biographies, if you read the footnotes in some of their works, well, most of their work, you will find references to Friedrich Schiller or to Shakespeare, who, I mean, he's certainly the most amazing author in our Western Hemisphere. And I guess I certainly admire this type of approach in education, this Renaissance type of approach. And I also, guys, I don't want to flatter you way too much, but this is what I appreciate with the Arctus company, that you're also expanding your horizons, not just in one single direction, but that you're basically covering from philosophy to literature to art and, of course, linguistics. That's also what we badly need now, because unfortunately, again, it's a topic I don't want to derail too much. I don't want to stray away from our topic, but I guess I'm very much worried about the kidnapping of our language, of our discourse by different and hostile elites. And I certainly want to make sure that we are the appropriators, that we are the owners of our language and our vocabulary. So again,
well, thanks for your praise, Tom.
Well, you deserve it, because guys, I know you have put a great deal of work in it. So I mean, it's not the matter of making you guys feel happy. It's just I know how hard it is, and I'm doing that day and night. And I certainly admire the scholarly work that you're doing, because this is what we badly need. We badly need some scholarly approach.
Thank you, and I also totally agree with you that the battle of the control of our language is probably the most important metapolitical battle we are fighting right now, because that is a battle the left and the liberals have been winning for the past 50 or 60 or 70 years, and it has been very detrimental to our society, obviously, and to our way of thinking, because without the proper terminology, you can't have a proper way of thinking, and that is what we are trying to correct now. I mean, together with a lot of other thinkers and writers and ideologues from the new right and so forth, and you are, of course, one of the most important ones there. But would you consider that the new right are the ideological heirs to the conservative revolutionaries?
Well, you mean conservative revolutionaries in the Weimar Republic or nowadays? There's a big time gap between those two.
The first ones, of course.
Well, yes. Well, of course. Let me, folks, with all due respect, with all, if I can say, with all self-respect, and I just don't want to exaggerate and don't want to praise myself. I guess it sounds a bit pathetic and a little bit not very decent on my part. But the fact of the matter is that I have basically in my book, the Against Democracy and Equality, including Alain de Benoit, who actually served as my role model and who actually taught me many things, both in terms of methodology, both in terms of handling the content of this composition and so on and so forth. We have all learned a great deal from our mega giants from the 20s and 30s, not just in Germany, but in Italy and France and elsewhere in Europe. So back from Sweden as well, and I'm not so much familiar with Nordic literature other than Knut Hamsun. I read him even when I was a boy. I read him very much. So again, Alain de Benoit basically in his book Seen from the Right Side. I don't know how it was translated into English.
View from the
hasn't
right.
been yet. Yeah. We're planning to do that later this year, actually.
Right. That's a tremendous. It's an encyclopedia. He basically, I'm now speaking on his behalf, and I'm sure he will agree with me. He has basically written a compendium of our heavy artillery, so to speak. And I hate to use the epithet conservative, because yes, it is conservative in a sense, but given the environment in Europe in the first half given the intellectual environment, in the first half of the 20th century, specifically in Central and Western Europe, I think that the expression neoconservative back then was quite appropriate. Although I certainly know, if you look at the pedigree of let's say, Sorel, who also fits into this category of the predecessors of the New Right, or Robert Michels, who's a German-Italian, or Gentile, or many other authors, Julius Evola, and so on. He also wrote extensively in the 30s. I mean, you really can't I don't think that they would love this expression conservatives. It was just a handy denominator back then, Neukonservativen, and I guess I'm sometimes clumsily lumping them together under this category, but I would be a little bit cautious of just plastering this label on them. They certainly are by and large they were the predecessor of what we today stand for. They're our sources of inspiration, not just inspiration in a sense of some political activities, but also the sense of also in the field of literature, in the field of art. And I guess I could just start naming and listing them. It would take quite a bit of time. So yes, I don't know if I'm reading you correctly, sir, but it seems to me that this was the focus of your question, right?
Well, I think you could say that the conservative revolutionaries in Germany had the same problem that the New Right in France was going to have half a century later, and that they weren't really right or left. They combined elements of both and also some completely new things. So I get that. Certainly, I think they represent different eras of the same project, you could say.
Absolutely. Except there is one exception, if I can add to that. In terms of free speech, in terms of getting published, they were far more published, and they were far more popular in the 10s and 20s and 30s in France and Italy and Germany and Austria and Sweden and elsewhere, and in the United States of America, if you wish. Then nowadays, when you start, even resuscitating their imagery, and you get some bad epithets, and you are subject to smear campaigns. So I guess this is false.
Yeah, and that is, I guess, mostly due to the current power balance and the
intellectual power balance, precisely.
Yeah.
I also I wish there were more students. Let's I understand that students in Sweden and in Austria and Croatia, they're all subject to this propaganda, to this brainwashing. Let's call it. It's a brainwashing. It's a liberal, transgender, post-Marxist brainwashing. Okay, just add a little traits, and you will get the idea of what I mean. But unfortunately, I wonder if those kids, aside from their political proclivities, or rather their trendy proclivities in terms of their self-denial, name it whichever way you wish, I wonder if they ever think, well, is there something else in this world? Is there some other explanation of let's say, of this or that? Is there some other explanation of, let's say, the subject of race? Or is there some other explanation of let's say, an author, Botticelli or whatever? Can I explain it differently from the ordinary stuff that my professors are feeding me with? I always admire people, individuals, students, regardless where they come from and their background. I admire them if they have a sense of curiosity. If they like delving a little bit into things and asking critical questions. But it seems to me now that there are very few of them. I don't see that many. They just dumb down. They appear to me so.
Yeah, I totally agree. And before we continue the discussion about the New Right and the conservative revolutionaries and your books, of course, it's time for a short music break. And we're going to listen to The Iron Fields with Triari. So talk to you after the break. back from the music break, and you just listened to Iron Fields with Triari. And we're talking about the European New Right with Dr. Tom Sunic.
Well, we've already talked quite a bit about Tom's first book, Against Democracy and Equality, but your second book is also very interesting and relevant to the New Right, which is your Homo Americanus, which is where you really you try to get to the roots of what it is that led to America to become this very destructive force in the world, acting against traditions and against traditional values all over the planet. So, what led you to write that book, Tom? What inspired you?
Good point, indeed. There were moments when I was in the United States, and there were quite a few of those moments when I really got depressed with this much cherished, much lauded system of mine back in communist Yugoslavia. When I romanticized the United States of America as a country of brave and a country of free. Well, after my sojourn and after my lengthy stay and after my teaching and after my studying in the United States of America, and I'm still going there, of course, I'm an American citizen, which I'm proud of. I don't know for how long, but I'm still proud of. And I guess, in a sense, I became disillusioned, and my disillusion started at the university. And so, side by side with my research on the traditionalist or conservative, we'll call it neoconservative, New Right heritage and our ancestry, I was also pretty much involved in the research, or rather musings and brooding over the American system. I guess that's the right word. And I was frequently disappointed, I must tell you that. And even on a personal level, I could probably give you lots of examples. What certainly struck me, and it took me quite a while to figure that out, was this very peculiar type of intellectual repression. It certainly didn't function in a brutal fashion as in a communist Yugoslavia, let's say what used to be communist Hungary back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s. But it was nonetheless an intellectual repression, which I gradually started to feel on my own skin. I noticed that many, for instance, when I was a student and when I was a professor later on, but first as a graduate student at the University of California, I noticed a certain amount of gregarianism, what's the right word, of sort of self-censorship, that's the better word, of self-censorship among my colleagues, including my professors. So I was approaching 30, I was 30, right? I was pushed into drawing some parallels between the communist system in communist Yugoslavia. It was still communist Yugoslavia back then. We are talking about the early 80s, right? And the capitalist United States of America, the land of the free and brave, right? So I noticed a certain amount of this intellectual, I don't want to use the harsh word terrorism, but it turned out to be a sort of a mild, soft type of a terrorism. Intellectual terrorism, which of course didn't leave any scars and physical scars on my body, or for that matter, but it did cause a great deal of frustration. I'll give you an example, probably a stupid example, which was probably the prime example which actually prompted me to write this book. Again, I will just backpedal a little bit. Back in communist Yugoslavia in the 50s, 60s, when I was still a boy, we had this quota system. Yugoslavia was composed of 6 different republics, 3 different languages, 4 different religions, It was just a mishmash of different countries. And there was a communist unifying rule that in the Communist League, you had a quota system. You had a quota system whereby it was mandatory for each republic, each constituent republic in the federal Yugoslavia, to delegate that many numbers of people to the Federal Assembly or whatever. I'm just simplifying this a little bit. And then all of a sudden it struck me that back in the United States of America, I discovered the very fancy term affirmative action. I didn't know back in the 80s what that really meant, but then I realized.
It was just getting started then.
So I guess I was just starting asking myself, I noticed one thing, it was always well packed in the United States. The package was beautiful. There was no harsh language like in communist Yugoslavia, where sentences were far more loaded with with ideological epithets. In the United States of America, I noticed in some of those legal documents and some of those school bylaws that everything was just sugared up, so to speak. I don't know if this expression exists. It always had a portion of sugar. It was all honeyed. It was all sweet-tongued. Yes. And I was, for an observer, for a first-time observer, or let's say just for an average observer, I don't think he would pay much attention to it. He would be disarmed by this glitz and glamour of Hollywood and of this non-stop light show on the American TV. I mean, it's an excellent way of really controlling the populace. But then I began to wonder, wow, in retrospect, why did not Tito, why did not Stalin use those fancy methods in order basically to project and to carry out the same goal of creating this fantasy land of La La Land? Now back to Shakespeare. I'll come to that. The last piece he wrote, just to say la 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 la. What was the last piece he wrote? It was a nice. Anyway.
The Tempest you're talking about.
What was that? Again, repeat.
The Tempest?
Yeah, The Tempest. Thank you very much. The Tempest. It's a very symbolic piece. You got to read it. Because
yes, I know.
Actually affected very much Aldous Huxley, who was one of my favorite, authors, who was incredibly introspective and very perceptive scholar, English scholar. I mean, he tried everything, and so did I. I mean, I also had to experiment with drugs like he did, to enter this different sphere of, of sort of a transgression into meta-reality. Okay, so anyway, I just don't want to bother you and your audience with that. But I did discover that this repression in the United States of America, specifically this political and media repression, was far more elegant, far more convincing, far more audible, far more palatable, far more digestible than back in the communist Yugoslavia. Because in Yugoslavia, this propaganda, this mendacity, if you wish, this double talk or double lingo, was so gross, so vulgar. So even a person with a modest IQ, even a person who was not particularly fond of literature, Shakespeare, or Tempest, thank you very much, it was fantastic. But I just got to reread some passages from it, some crazy creatures in this book. And anyway, I discovered that, and this is what actually prompted me to write this book, because I always wanted to explore a little bit the origins of this how can I say, of this self-censorship, of this, let's call it decent, mild repression that I felt, particularly in academia. And of course, I can do that when I was, I was very much disappointed later on. When I must tell you, I had top-notch, student evaluations from my students, but I always had to find myself in a position where I had to curtail my lingo, and I had to give passing grades to my minority students just to avoid some legal problems.
Oh, I'm quite sure that would have been the case, but as far as the theme of the book goes, it struck me that you were basically expanding on something that Alain de Benoit and other thinkers of the New Right have talked about over the years, which is namely, this myth of American exceptionalism and universalism and absolute egalitarianism, which kind of grew up out of the American puritanical tradition and kind of took over America, the 20th century, in which this type of liberalism that America is exporting around the world now kind of grew out of that. And I also appreciated the fact in the book that you talked about these alternatives to that, I think you have a chapter in there on the Southern agrarians, which to me, they're just, they were fantastic. I mean, they harken back to the antebellum South, which it was a South based on not economic values or notions of equality like you have in America today, but on a sense of a just hierarchy and on tradition and on higher cultural values, which is something that's it's almost vanished from the U.S. today. But is that I guess that's what you were trying to accomplish with that book as well.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you have pointed this out. And in fact, I could now go into lengths and explain in detail much more. Yes, I must admit I was quite critical, and I am still critical of this hyper-moralism, which to a large extent, in the United States of America, which derives from Calvinism, even in the secular version, in the secular modalities, this moralism, which is quite obvious and very, very salient, particularly in the political decision making. I mean, of course, Tocqueville talks about this and so on, and especially some French and some German authors as well. And then, of course, I must tell you, and again, let me just clarify one thing. There's a great deal of misunderstandings between the European quote-unquote conservatives and their quote-unquote, I must say quote-unquote anti-Americanism and American conservatives. First and foremost, let me tell you that often this very generic expression anti-Americanism is often, I must tell you, a code word, for liberalism.
Yes.
Liberalism actually originated in its ideal form. It was implemented, not originated, actually it was implemented in its ideal form in the United States of America. And here's a very interesting thing, not just on a political level, on a historical level, if you look at the antebellum South and just prior to the Civil War, rather to the Civil War, we can call it, in 1963, you had most European countries, most European states siding up with the South. So keep that in mind, okay? And it is no accident whatsoever that even nowadays some of the quote-unquote anti-American scholars who are sort of writing sometimes derogatory things about, without even knowing what America very well, who have never lived there in the first place, are very fond of, guess what, of the Southerners.
Yes.
And everybody is fond of this. And one thing I've got to tell you on a personal level, I'm shocked and I'm dismayed. You mentioned the Southern agrarians that I talk about quite extensively in my book, that they have not been much more discussed by American conservatives, right-wingers, neo-right, alternative rights, call them whichever way you wish, because this is such a treasure trove, which in a way, can you imagine, ironically, it even precedes the new right in Europe, because Southern agrarians wrote about, I didn't read them all, but we read all. We have to take our stand. We read some of those poets, great poets. And I'll think about those names. I just can't keep track of all those names. My favorite authors, primarily because of his marvelous style, and secondly, his content. I don't want to diminish now the value of George Orwell, but if you truly want to understand this lingo of today, this distorted language of today on equality, human rights, and all this stuff, please tell your readers, tell your audience to read Fitzhugh. He's a great author, a man of astounding intelligence, a great scholar. He was fluent in Greek and Latin, and of course he was a Southerner. And I often quote him and I often read him because literally when I read something George Orwell, I must fall back on him because he actually uncovered the mystique of egalitarianism, of human rights. He discusses that quite in length. So yes, again, if I can just sum up a little bit, ironically, among Southern agrarians, you will find the predecessors, or you will find actually the point which is unavoidable in our study of the European New Right.
Yes, I agree. That's something. Actually, that's a point that Guillaume Faye makes in one of his books. He talks about how really what the French New Right did was to take a lot of ideas that had originally appeared in the United States and that had kind of fallen by the wayside, and they kind of took them and recast them in a European context.
Absolutely. Well, of course, this tells you again how selective we have all become, and that's why I'm very, very skeptical. And also, I'm not just skeptical, but I'm what's the better word in English? I'm losing my train of thought a little bit. I'm very suspicious of this modern curriculum in political science and sociology. I mean, how many American students, graduate students, know about Fitzhugh? How many? Well, he's not a Southern agrarian. He comes 100 years earlier than that. But I'm sure there are dozens of other authors that I'm not all familiar with, who for a variety of reasons, mostly we know which reasons, the selective attitudes to humanities after the Second World War, and of course with this affirmative action stuff and so on. So people are simply oblivious of this great treasure trove that still exists in some parts, and it used to exist in the United States of America.
I think it's I think it's the same in most European countries, at least in Western Europe. I mean, in Sweden we had many great thinkers and authors that just disappeared in the memory hole, to use George Orwell's terminology. That were just completely forgotten, and their books were taken out of print, and they're simply not available anymore because they were not politically correct. They didn't fit the PC narrative and so forth. But what I want to ask you a little bit more about is this very important concept of soft totalitarianism. I mean, it's a central concept within the New Right, and I know that you've talked a lot about this yourself, among other things, of course. But at one of the lectures I went to that you held in Sweden, you kind of expanded on that concept quite a bit, and I think that is a very important concept to understand how the modern Western democracy works and how this politically correct liberal elite is able to maintain their power. So could you, for our listeners, maybe expand a little bit on that concept?
Yes. Well, first, I must tell you, contrary to some of my colleagues, to most of my colleagues, again, I don't like using this term totalitarianism. You remember what I said about a while ago, about a half an hour earlier, we were discussing about the semantic distortions. Mm-hmm. Now, I always want to know exactly what this word means today and what it meant, let's say, 70, 80 years or 90 years ago when it was first launched. Now, in some books, in Italian and especially in German, you will find the word, and even in French, some authors, we can call some of them, even a fascist author or close to fascism, some of them even some of them conservative authors. The word totalitarianism did not have such a negative connotation as it does nowadays. Now, the word totalitarianism was basically propelled, so to speak, by Hannah Arendt in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. So nowadays it has become a sort of a cognate of something evil, something demonical, something ugly, and so on and so forth. And again, we are witnessing those semantic distortions. I'm not adding to it any value judgments. I'm not saying that totalitarianism is good or bad. I'm just telling you that this word has become so widespread to the extent that everybody can use this word and nobody at the same time. It is associated with something terrible, with something awful. Now, let's keep in mind, at least for the sake of convenience, that this word in their late 1919, 1921, 23, 24 did not have a negative connotation. So basically, if you study the etymology of it, it was often used. Well, I guess I should probably quote some authors. What was the Belgian author who wrote? I just can't think of the name of the Flemish author. The late 30s. He uses the word.
I know who you're talking about, but I can't remember it either.
Yeah, and he uses.
We've been recommended to translate him into English, by our Flemish friends.
I used to be familiar. I read him in French. He wrote the book, and he uses this word. And I'll tell you also about Carl Schmitt. He uses the word not totalitarian. He wears the totaler Staat. Is one of his books. The totaler Staat, total state. It did not have, I must repeat that, it did not have a negative connotation. Now, when we talk about the total state nowadays, of course, we panic. We just back up, and we say, oh, what the hell is going on? Now, back then, this was often used, this word, especially in the Weimar Germany, or by those scholars, totaler Staat, for an organic state. An organic state, of course, has a milder connotation. It has a somewhat more applicable for us connotation. It has a somewhat romantic connotation. So again, before I talk about totalitarianism, before we talk about, again, folks, I have to come back to my first point that I made. We gotta solidly specify or decipher rather the meaning of the word totalitarianism, totalitarism, which was very seldom, which is rarely used, a word back in the 20s and 30s in a negative way. Nowadays, again, I repeat, 56, 57, when this book by Hannah Arendt came out and became sort of a house demon. You don't want to mess around with totalitarians. By the by, look, I don't know if you're familiar with the book. What's the name of the guy? Joseph was an American guy of Jewish ancestry, German Jewish ancestry. He wrote the book on democratic totalitarian democracy, or the totalitarian democracy. We studied that in the graduate courses at UC Santa Barbara. The totalitarian democracy. Please do have a look at this book, where he actually traces totalitarianism to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and some encyclopedist authors, and then it goes back to, of course, the French Revolution and so on. So again, there are millions of explanations nowadays as far as totalitarianism means. But one thing in common, when you lump all those authors together, even some of our friends, even including Alain de Benoit, who is using this word quite commonly, and so do I, in a negative fashion, short of something better. We associate this word totalitarianism with something very, very evil. Again, so just as I tried to clarify some concepts about the European New Right, I'm also trying to clarify this concept of totalitarianism. Short of a better alternative, I myself am using this word totalitarianism. I prefer the word which was far more common in the Roman Empire and also in Greece and in ancient Greece, and this is tyranny. I like the word tyranny, of course. It's a modern tyranny. So yes, the word totalitarianism didn't exist back then. So
by the way, the author you mentioned is Jacob Talman, I think.
Jacob Talman, exactly. Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate Jacob Talman. He was of Jewish, German, American ancestry, and I wrote his books twice. I read his books. A very good book, by the way. Very well annotated. It's a good bibliography. Jacob Talman. Excellent. I guess we got to bring it to the attention of our readers and our listeners. It's an important book, I don't necessarily have to read the books of my friends and my authors that I'm sympathetic to, but also the folks that I'm not familiar with. There's a big debate. He actually is very critical of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and his social contract. And he's very, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was heavily attacked even by neocons in the United States of America as one of the originator of modern totalitarianism. Now, again, you got to be careful. You got to put things in a right historical perspective. I don't want to make too many digressions, but Alain de Benoit has recently written very scholarly pieces on the good points and good parts of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the sense of community, very important. And again, it's hard for me to argue, but I would say that bluntly, guys, if you don't mind, if we can just fast forward a little bit, that the modern system, such as we know it now, this liberalism system, is far more dangerous, let's call it totalitarianism, than any previous totalitarianism so far. For the simple reason, and let me paraphrase Alain de Benoit, it doesn't kill the body, but it kills the soul.
Yes,
so it's one of the, it's amazingly effective system. It's amazingly, that's what Ernest Jünger wrote also in his diaries. You don't really know who your enemy is any longer. You don't even notice that. You got to literally spend hours and hours brooding, thinking, reflecting on this notion of tyranny, or call it totalitarianism. I'm sorry if I got to back up always to this word. But I guess this is a horrible system we live in. Truly horrible. Not necessarily because the system kills me or imprisons me or puts people to jail for political incorrectness like in France or in Germany, but it's actually, it renders people stupid. It dumbs them down. It just makes them trivial. It makes them like perishable commodities. I observe it on the daily basis, and I'm deadly scared because I see even young kids, they live in this surreal world, just like on this Tempest Island, just like they live in this surreal world of and it's actually incredibly effective. And I noticed that, of course, a long time ago in the United States of America, back to Homo Americanus. And now I come to Homo Croaticus or Homo Germanicus. It's just the same species that frightens me, And
well, that's an interesting question, though, Tom. Of course, you're from Croatia. You still live there. I know that Croatia was, like Hungary, was, at the forefront of this so-called migrant crisis last summer. What is the situation in Croatia today? It sounds like you're not very happy with the way things are going.
No, I'm
right
not happy. Again, we're here in the system again. Look, it's let me just try to let me get my act together a little bit. Let me just put it quite clearly. Croatia is now part and parcel of the European Union and the NATO system, of course. So it's part of the system, if you wish. Whether you like it or not, it's part of the system. So it has to flow with the traffic. It has to abide by the rules and regulations and the ukases from Brussels. And I'm not happy. I'm not happy. That's a very modest way of saying that. I'm terribly scared of this because, Croatia first is a small country. It has 4 million people. Secondly, it's right on the Balkan route. It's very close to, I'm 5 miles from Slovenian border here right now. So it's right here in Central Europe. And what I'm afraid of, that the system, specifically the system in Brussels, will certainly impose its quota of migrants, and then Croatia, because it wants, while trying to retain, to put it better, more eloquently, while trying to retain its democratic and liberal certificate, will accept, 2,000 or 5,000 or 50,000 Asian African immigrants. Of course, this will result in a chaotic situation. Now, as far as Hungary is concerned, I see, guys, that we are changing a little bit the shape of our discussion. Now, just as much as I admire what Orban did, and I guess he's really pursuing a very, very fine and very realistic policies, the problem with Hungary is that there is no way to retain its status of a white European enclave. This is no longer possible for Croatia, despite the fact that it's a highly homogeneous and racial level, ethnic level. It's not possible for Ukraine. It's not possible for any country in Central and Eastern Europe, which paradoxically are far more European on the ethnic level, on the racial level, than West European countries. There's no question about that. Certainly much more than Sweden or Germany nowadays. But with this onslaught of so many people, so many from not just different cultures, but from different gene pool, there is no way of expecting that this will not spill over eventually, and tragically, this time from the west to the east. So I guess I'm a little bit pessimistic.
Well, I mean, as long as more countries within the EU, like the Visegrad countries, for example, refuses and protests to these enforced migrant quotas, which they've done so far successfully. I mean, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and Czech Republic. I'm sure there is still hope to prevent this from happening. And when it comes to Western Europe, I mean, the welfare systems, the infrastructure is on the verge of collapse, which will mean that the pull factors that attracts migrants from the other side of the globe, basically, to come to Sweden and Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands and so forth, will disappear, and the incentives for people to staying there will also disappear. So I'm still quite hopeful. I truly believe that there is hope to resolve this in a peaceful way by implementing, for example, subsidies for people remigrating to their home countries from Western Europe, while at the same time telling them that, well, we're out of money, we can't give you any more welfare, but you will get this amount if you go back. So I definitely think it's possible to solve. The important task at hand here for Central and Eastern Europe is to just kind of hold their positions, or your positions, until that time comes, which I think it will within the next 10, 15 years. So I think as long as you are able to refuse these quotas that the EU is trying to impose on you, you will be just fine.
Well, you're talking about the quotas and talking about the Brussels now. Once upon a time, it was Moscow which made the rules and which actually ran the show here in Eastern Europe. And nowadays you have Brussels, and of course the same ukases, and you simply can't object to it because you get punished. And
but just as the Soviet Union fell, I mean, the European Union will eventually fall as well.
Yes, let's hope this will be actually, it's self-destroying. There's no question about that. But it just, I wonder what will be the end end results. I'm not happy at all. Of course, I'm not deterministic in history, so I always believe in chance, in accident, and I believe that with some capable, sudden man, certain sudden things can happen. And, history is always open. I like quoting, great authors in Emmental and de Benoit Spengler. He wrote about this. History is always open. So this certainly can provide us some solace or some hope. But as things are right now, and I guess, listen, like I said, we don't need to make any disclaimers here. It's an open show. I don't blame the Asians or the African migrants. I blame all decadent and hostile elites. It's just absolutely. Yes. Be it in Sweden and to some extent in Croatia now, they're trying to. What do you call it? Not backpedal, but they're towing the line. They have this certificate. They want to get this good certificate. The mindset of the Croatian political class. Croatia, we suffer from this terrible complex of fascism and Ustaša during the Second World War. So we have to exonerate ourselves from those bad images, just like the Germans, just like Madame Merkel, you see. We have to exonerate ourselves from our bad past, for Geschichtsbewältigung, as the Germans call it, by actually trying to be more papal than the Pope, by trying to be more Catholic than the Pope. So, and that's why, this elites in Croatia, I can tell you quite frankly, they're so I admire, basically, I said it earlier, this gentleman Orban, because at least he has got guts, You don't see that much. We had it once with Franjo Tuđman, but now with the elites in Croatia, they just want to show that they are more Brussellois than the Brussels paparazzi's themselves. And I'm not happy with this at all.
No, should it be? And actually, that the same goes for Sweden. Even though we weren't even involved in the Second World War, we have this propaganda telling us that we have to exonerate ourselves for not stopping the Holocaust and whatnot.
Yes, absolutely. I understand. When I look at the pictures of all those prime ministers and all this political class in Sweden, I see no difference, and even in Brussels, they all look to me the same. They're phenotypes. I mean, I don't want to say they're Marxist, but they're just hyper-moralistic, self-hating, self-denying. They live in a big self-denier. And because literally, I have never seen such a political class in Europe over the last 300 years. Even if you study the pictures of the ruler, if you look at the Gustav II in Sweden, if you look at Wallenstein, if you look at the Maximilian, if you look at the Franz Josef, even if you look at the Jefferson and Thomas Paine, just study their faces a little bit. You will not see those stupid smiles, this big teeth, and what are dentures or whatever. They were just people who had a sense of the tragic, just like Shakespeare used to teach. They had a sense of the tragic. They knew that everything passes, that everything rots away eventually. But those guys, when you look at those women in Sweden, when you look at this political class in the United States of America or in Croatia, Jesus, you sometimes wonder, is this something genetically wrong with those people?
They're
utopians.
Or very stupid and corrupt people. But to kind of reconnect to what you said before about not being a determinist, historical determinist, I think it's very interesting to tap into the thoughts of Guillaume Faye. He proposes this spherical historical view instead of the cyclical historical view proposed by Spengler, where the spherical one means that we can actually, it's a sphere that we can actually push and affect ourselves. We can push it in either direction. It's open. It's not determined. We can affect the outcome of history, and that is one of the ideas I like most about Faye, his optimism and his non-deterministic attitude towards us, because that is something that we need today.
Well, certainly. Look, I don't want to sound like a suicidal guy. As I said earlier, the history is always open. But again, that's the reason why I'm immersing myself more and more into Greek classics, because they had the sense of the tragic. They did not kill themselves, but they realized that unless there's a will to power, there is a certain will to survival, you can't have much success. And again, as I said, the entire across-the-board species of the European political class, regardless whether this is in Spain or for that matter in Ukraine, or whether people in DC or whether people in Brussels, I'm really stunned with their false optimism, with their hypermoralism, with their self-denial. That's the best word, self-denial. They live in an absolutely crazy world of self-denial. I don't know which better way of putting it. And they cannot serve as role models for students or for future politicians in Europe. So basically, we need folks with a sense of the tragic and whatever. When this case of emergency arises on the horizons, and I'm not ruling that out, then we shall see who our true friends are and who our foes are. And then we shall see who the real dictators or who the real radicals are. It's a very tough topic indeed that we have tackled now on. And I guess I don't really think we have that much time left, but I certainly would be pleased to discuss this topic of a case of emergency one of these days with you, and then we can cover a little bit Carl Schmitt, and not just Carl Schmitt, but also Machiavelli and other authors. And of course, we can talk about Shakespeare as well.
Definitely, and we'll do that. We'll definitely do a follow-up podcast with you. But as you say, we don't have much time left. It's kind of time to wrap this up. So could you tell our listeners how to get hold of your books, and if there are any websites you would like to recommend, or Facebook pages or whatever? Feel free to give some recommendations to our listeners.
I will sum it up a little bit, folks. I'm sure, folks, you can come across my name if you just type my name in your Google. You can Google my name. That's a no verb now. To Google, Google is not just.
Yes, it's become a verb.
It has become a verb. That's the beauty of the English language. So yes, folks. We forgot to say that, and I guess there's nothing wrong and there's nothing gleeful about that. But I also published a couple of books in French language. And I'm very pleased to talk and chat, and not just chat, to give lectures on French literature in particular. So yes, a couple of books. Feel free, folks, to write to me, tom.sunic@gmail.com, or please have a look at my website, www.tomsunic.com. And if I can, folks, I mean it, if I can be of any assistance, especially some younger students who love to have this organic, I'm not totalitarian, but organic, holistic approach to human sciences. We now call it interdisciplinary approach. Folks who just as much like reading The Raven by what was this great author, great poet?
Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah, Edgar Allan Poe. Thank you very much. Helping me twice already. Or who likes to read about the hookah, the water pipe by Charles Baudelaire. He used to smoke dope. He was dope. So yes, I can do that because I tried that myself, folks, when I was in India. So anyway, or if folks, you would like to discuss a little bit the case of emergency in Shakespeare's books, or for that matter, if you would like to discuss Carl Schmitt, why not, folks? There's nothing wrong with that. I've always admired. This was one of the reasons also that why I miss the United States of America, because it still has the First Amendment. I can still get hold of some books on race and religion, and something that are practically unavailable here in the United States of America. I'm saying here in Europe, and hopefully, I hope if Trump wins, I'm not ruling out that I'll relocate. So, guys, feel free to call me and write to me. And if you are guys interested in any research, and if you're doing something, be it in German, English, or French, I'll be happy to discuss that with you. I frequently give lectures in German, in Austria, and in Germany, and I guess I might be here in the vicinity of Hungary sometimes during the summertime. But yes, guys, write to me and I'll see what I can do. And thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you very much for being a guest on our show. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Tune in a few days for the next episode. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.